I've been asked to tell this story more times than I can count, usually by people who want it to be something it isn't. They want heroism. They want a moment where I stood tall and defied an empire with fire in my eyes. I understand the impulse. The story has the shape of that kind of thing, if you squint at it from the right angle. But that's not what happened. What happened was that I was exhausted, my rib hurt, and I didn't run because my legs decided not to. That's the honest version. I've told the other version twice, for official inquiries. Because the official version requires a protagonist with intentions. I'll give you the honest one. My name is Marin Voss. I was 43 years old when Orath Barge 7 departed the Leadenhall Processing Station. 812 civilians in its cargo decks, bound for the Varath interior. I had been a residential block coordinator on Leadenhall for 11 years, which meant I scheduled maintenance, mediated neighbor disputes, kept records. I was good at it. I was not good at anything that required courage, and I want to be clear about that up front, because the story tends to attract a certain kind of listener who starts nodding before I finish, and already has me cast as something I was not. My daughter Sella was 16. She is the reason I was on the barge at all. When the Varath processing order came through for our residential block, I had the option to appeal my own classification. Residential coordinators with more than 8 years of service were briefly eligible for an administrative exemption, a window that closed in 72 hours. I did not file the appeal. Sella's transfer papers in order, and got on the barge with her. That was the whole of my heroism. It was not nothing. It was also not what people want to hear when they ask about the Karath. The barge was a converted bulk carrier. The Varath had stripped out whatever it had previously hauled and replaced it with tiered sleep shelf units, 4 communal processing rooms, and a garrison bay forward of midship that housed approximately 40 Varath soldiers and their command staff. You could tell it had been a working freight vessel from the way the space was engineered. Everything was structural efficiency and load-bearing consideration, nothing designed for people to inhabit long-term. Ventilation system moved air but didn't properly cycle it, so the sleep shelf tiers had a persistent smell of warm bodies and recycled atmosphere that never fully dissipated. The lighting was adequate during scheduled day cycle and went to dim amber during rest cycle, which was the one concession to comfort that didn't require bureaucratic approval to maintain. You were grateful for small things. A vessel like that, adequately moving air, amber light instead of darkness. The garrison operated on a simple principle: compliance maintained comfort. Non-compliance degraded comfort. This was explained to us during the first briefing. Standing in the lower cargo bay with its ceiling, 2 stories above our heads, and its floor still bearing the scored marks of whatever freight had been loaded there before us. The scoring ran in long parallel lines from the forward wall to the aft, and you could see where load-securing bolts had been cut away, and the deck plating had been ground smooth, afterward, mostly smooth. In the corners of the bay there were still bolted housings that had once held equipment or freight anchors, and now held nothing, just the housings themselves, which is the specific melancholy of repurposed industrial space. All the evidence of the thing it used to be. The briefing officer was Garrison Commander Davith Sal, a Varath of middle rank, who had the look of someone who had been given a posting he considered beneath him, and was making peace with that fact by running it with great thoroughness. I was assigned as a block warden for the civilian contingent almost immediately because I had the administrative background and because no one else in my cohort volunteered. It was not a real position of authority. It meant I received information from the garrison liaison 20 minutes before the general population did, and in return I was expected to convey that information to my block in an orderly fashion and absorb whatever complaints arose. I was, in effect, buffer. I understood this. I accepted it because it gave me something to do during the long processing days, and because it kept me near the garrison liaison's office, which had slightly better ventilation than the sleep shelf tier, where Sella and I were. The first 2 weeks were grinding but not violent. There were shortages. There were arbitrary rule changes. There were inspections at irregular hours that left people humiliated and exhausted. A man in Block 3, an older man named Torvin, who had been a machinist, refused an order to surrender a set of personal tools that were clearly not weapons and were, clearly, his livelihood. 2 garrison soldiers escorted him to the forward processing room. He came back the same evening, without the tools and without the particular steadiness he'd had before. He sat down on his shelf and didn't speak for 2 days. This was the shape of daily life on Orith Barge 7. The incident with me and the baton happened on the 14th day. I have to include it because it matters to what came later, though it is not a proud part of the account. A garrison patrol moved through our block during morning meal distribution, and one of the soldiers, young, with the particular restlessness that young soldiers with unchecked authority tend to develop, decided that the queue was improperly formed. He began moving people with the butt end of his suppression baton, not hard enough to injure, just enough to make the point that the point could be made. I told him, in what I intended to be a neutral and professional tone, the queue was forming correctly, per the posted guidelines, and that if he had a different standard in mind, he should post it, so we could comply. I said it badly. I know that now. The neutral and professional tone I intended came out as something he read as challenge. Before I fully understood what was happening, the baton had caught me across the left side of my ribcage. It was not a serious injury. Cracked. Not broken, the medical officer said the next morning, which was the earliest I could get an appointment, and she gave me a pressure wrap and told me to avoid sudden twisting movements. I went back to my warder duties. The garrison liaison sent out through the internal system saying the soldier's conduct was being reviewed. I did not hear anything further about that review. The rib hurt most when I breathed deeply, which was all the time, and when I lay down, which was the only time I had to lie down. It gave me a useful focus. When things were bad, I thought about the rib, and somehow that reduced the scope of the badness to something manageable. This is not a coping technique I would recommend, but it was what I had. The announcement about the Karath came through on the 21st day, delivered by Commander Dovethsal in person to the assembled population of Seam, all 4 blocks in the lower cargo bay. He stood on a raised platform at the forward end of the bay with 2 officers flanking him and explained, with the satisfied precision of a man who has prepared his remarks, that a compliance review had identified an elevated pattern of procedural resistance across the civilian contingent. This resistance, he said, could not be permitted to continue. As a demonstration of the garrison's operational capacity, and as an instrument of the review, a Karath would be deployed into the lower cargo bay at 0600 the following morning. We were to be present. Most of the adults in the bay had heard of a Karath. Those who hadn't learned quickly from those who had, in the hours after the announcement, in low voices on the sleep shelf tiers while the lights dimmed. A Karath was a hive creature, a Verith instrument of crowd suppression and psychological compliance. It was not trained, exactly. It was conditioned, which was a different thing. It responded to certain biochemical signatures in the air, most of which were signatures that large concentrations of frightened beings tend to induce. It moved through crowds. It was not designed to kill, in the sense that its parameters were set for suppression rather than lethality. The distinction was academic, in the way that many institutional distinctions are academic. People had been killed. The Verith acknowledged this, the way institutions acknowledge statistics, as an unfortunate margin, regrettable, within acceptable parameters. A Karath massed roughly the same as a large draft animal. It moved on 6 articulated limbs and carried its head mass, a cluster of sensory organs, and the resonance frills it used for both communication and threat display. At roughly shoulder height on a human adult, which meant it could look you in the face while standing. The resonance frills, when fully extended in threat posture, produced a subsonic pressure that registered as dread in the chests of most beings that had evolved an autonomic fear response. The Verith used Karath in pairs usually for large crowd actions. For 800 civilians in a sealed cargo bay, they were sending one. I spent the night thinking about Sela. Not in a morbid way, in the specific way that parents spend nights thinking about their children when they are not able to prevent what is coming. A cataloging. A mental accounting of what I needed her to understand and what I needed to make sure I'd said, clearly enough that she would retain it, even in the worst case. I thought about the particular combination of her mother's calm and her own stubbornness that Sela had developed into something useful, the way she processed hard information and let it settle before she did decide what to do with it. I thought about the summer she was 9, when we had been caught in a weather emergency on a rural transit and had spent 6 hours in a crowded maintenance shelter, and how she had organized the children near us into a singing game without anyone asking her to, just because there were children and they were scared and it was something to do. She had been 9 years old. She had not waited for an adult to do it. I had watched her from across the shelter and felt the specific pride that doesn't have a clean word, pride that is also something like gratitude and something like relief. She was 16 now, and she was on the shelf tier above me, and I could not protect her from the morning any more than I had been able to protect her from the weather emergency, which meant what I could do was make sure she had the information and trust that she had inherited enough of whatever got through that maintenance shelter when she was 9. She was not in the lower cargo bay with me that night. She was on the sleep shelf tier above, in the company of 3 other girls her age she'd befriended, and I had decided not to tell her the specifics of what was planned for the morning. She would be in the bay. She would see it. But I didn't want her to spend the night I'd just spent. I told her at 05:30, in the 15 minutes before we were required to file down. I told her matter-of-factly, the way I tried to tell her most things. I had discovered over 16 years of parenting that Sela handled information better than she handled the protective management of information. She went still in the way she went still when she was absorbing something and deciding how to feel about it. Then she said, "Will you be in the front?" I said yes. Block wardens were positioned in the first 2 rows. She said, "Okay," and then she tied her hair back and followed me down the corridor. The lower cargo bay at 0600 was very quiet. 800 people trying not to breathe loudly is a particular kind of quiet, dense, and pressurized. I was in the second row, which in practice meant the first row, because the designated first row civilians had drifted back in the night, and no one from the garrison was going, and forced their positions now. The garrison staff were arranged along the walls and on the raised platform. Commander Devithsal stood at the forward end with an expression of official neutrality that I had learned over 3 weeks was his genuine resting state. The Karath entered through the forward port hatch at 0603, according to the bay's wall clock, which I was watching, because I needed to look at something that wasn't the hatch. I have seen reconstructions of what it looked like entering the bay. They do not capture the sound, which preceded the creature by several seconds, and was less a sound than a physical property of the air, a shift in pressure that my nervous system interpreted as the onset of something bad. Several people behind me made sounds. Someone near the left wall sat down on the deck, which was not permitted, and no garrison soldier moved to correct them. I noticed, at the edges of my awareness, that the garrison soldiers themselves had changed posture. They had not moved from their positions, but they were standing differently, with the particular stillness of people who are trained to hold their ground and are actively having to use that training. The Karath moved into the bay on all 6 limbs with a fluidity that was entirely unlike what I had imagined. I had imagined something mechanical, something that moved with the rigid purposiveness of a weapon. It did not move that way. It moved the way large animals move when they are not threatened, with a kind of settled confidence that occupies space rather than crossing it. Its resonance frills were partially extended, but not in full threat display. It turned its head mass and swept the bay, and the subsonic pressure in the air changed with each sweep, as though it were reading something. In the moment when it swept toward our section of the crowd, the pressure spiked, not dramatically, not beyond the baseline dread that had been present since its entry, but noticeably, in a way that made the breath catch. Then it moved on, and the pressure receded fractionally, and the breath could be let out. The crowd pressed back. This is what happens with large frightened groups. The impulse is collective and involuntary, a wave moving away from the source, and it moved through the 800 people in that bay like something physical. I felt it from behind, the press of people, the shuffle of feet. I did not move back, not because I was brave, But because I had people directly in front of me, the first row having dissolved, and I had nowhere to go that wasn't into someone else. The rib flared when someone's elbow caught me in the side. I made myself breathe slowly through my nose. The Karath moved along the front row. It passed the first 3 people, a woman with a child on her hip, 2 men standing close together, and the resonance frills shifted each time, reading, assessing, doing whatever they did. The woman with the child was making a high, sustained note through closed lips, the kind of sound that comes out of you without permission. The men had their eyes closed. The creature reached me. I want to be careful here because this is the part that gets elaborated in retellings, and the elaborations are not accurate. What actually happened? The Karath stopped in front of me, and its head mass came down to approximately my eye level, and we were roughly a forearm's length apart, and I looked at it. That's all. I looked at it because I was there, and it was there, and those were the facts. I was not calm. My heart was doing something agricultural, and my rib was doing what it did. But I was also, I think, simply out of escalation. I had been afraid for 3 weeks. I had been afraid in the particular grinding way that doesn't peak, that doesn't resolve, that just accumulates like sediment. And I think there was a layer below the fear that was something closer to flatness, and that was the layer that was operating when the Karath put its face in front of mine. It was warm. I registered this because I was close enough to register it. There was warmth coming off the head mass, not unpleasant. The warmth of something alive rather than something mechanical. The frills were moving slowly, reading, and the subsonic pressure was there. But it was not doing the thing it had been doing when the creature entered. It had changed register. I don't know how to describe that except to say it felt less like dread and more like attention. I didn't do anything. I didn't reach out. I didn't make sounds. I stood there with my cracked rib and my 3 weeks of sediment fear, and I looked at the Karath, and the Karath looked at me. Then it pressed the side of its head mass against my left shoulder. Not hard. Not with the force of something asserting dominance or delivering threat. The way a large dog leans against a person it has decided to trust. The weight of it was substantial. I had to set my feet, but it was not aggressive weight. It was settling weight. The weight of something that has decided to be where it is. The resonance frills folded, not partway, not in threat attenuation, all the way down, flat against the head mass, the way they apparently go when a Karath is at rest. I learned this later. In the moment I did not know what it meant. I only knew that the subsonic pressure in my chest was gone, replaced by something that was simply quiet. Behind me, the bay had gone very still. The Karath's handler was a Verath soldier named Gethrak Ven, a specialist who had worked with the creature for what I later learned was 4 deployment cycles. He was standing at the perimeter with a long-handled suppression interface. Not a weapon, exactly. The Verath were careful about that language. But a device that delivered a specific signal the Karath was conditioned to respond to. A recall command. He activated it. The Karath did not respond. Gethrakvan activated it again. I heard it. There was a tone, very brief, at the edge of audible range. The Karath turned its head slightly toward the sound, and then turned back. It had not moved from my side. Its weight was still against my shoulder. Bay was silent, in a completely different way than it had been silent when the creature entered. It had been a compressed silence before, a held-breath silence. Now it was the silence of a room in which something has happened that no one has a word for yet. Psst. Commander David Sal descended from the raised platform. I watched him come down the steps with the careful, controlled movement of someone managing their own expression. He crossed the bay floor to where Gethrak Ven was standing, and the two of them exchanged words I could not hear. Gethrak Ven activated the recall signal a 3rd time, then a 4th. The Karath pressed its head mass more firmly against my shoulder. It was not a hostile gesture. I want to be clear about that, because it is sometimes described as the creature defending me, or choosing to protect me, and those are not wrong exactly, but they're also not the texture of what it was. It felt more like the creature settling, like it had found the place it intended to be, and was communicating this through the medium of weight and warmth and the folded frills, and the fact that it simply did not move. There was a quality to it that I can only describe imprecisely as relief, though whether that was the creature's state or my own projection I cannot say. What I can say is that I put my hand on the side of the headmass. I didn't plan this. My hand moved before I thought about it. The same hand moves toward a shoulder when someone sits down next to you in distress. The headmass was warm, and the surface was not what I expected. Not rigid chitin, but something between chitin and membrane. Texture like old well-worn leather. And when my hand rested there, the creature made a sound. Low, not subsonic. Audible. A sound that came from somewhere in the chest cavity or the body cavity. I couldn't tell. A sustained resonance that was not threatening and was not distressed. It was the sound, I thought later, of a very large thing deciding to rest. I heard Commander Davith Sal say something in Varath to his officers. I don't speak Varath well, but I have since had the phrase translated. What he said was approximately, "Get the Imperial Observer out of the bay." An Imperial Observer was a different category of personnel from the garrison. The Varath Imperial fleet operated on multiple layers of authority, and one of those layers was a civilian administrative oversight function that embedded observers with garrison units on processing vessels. The observer on Orath Barge 7 was a senior functionary named Varath Deal, a slight Varath in formal administrative robes, who had attended the demonstration from a secured position near the aft wall. Getting the Imperial Observer out of the bay meant that Commander Davith Sal had concluded that what was happening in the bay was something he needed to contain before it was witnessed further. The observer did not leave. I found this out later. At the time, I was not watching the observer. I was standing with a Karath leaning against me, while the creature's handler made increasingly formal attempts to recall it, and the garrison command structure attempted to manage what was becoming an incident. I was watching the Karath's frills, because they were the most legible part of the situation. They stayed folded. Commander Davith Sal approached. He crossed the bay floor directly toward me, which was not a short walk, and he did it with his hands loose at his sides, in the deliberate way that trained soldiers approach unpredictable situations. He stopped at what I estimated was 3 meters. Far enough to be outside the Karath's immediate response radius, close enough to be making a statement. "Refugee Voss," he said. He had learned my name, apparently. "Commander," I said. "Step away from the Karath." I had not thought about whether I should step away. I thought about it now. The Karath's weight was against my shoulder, warm and settled, and the weight was distributed in a way that suggested the creature had actually lowered itself slightly onto its hindmost limbs, which lowered its headmass to my height with less effort. It was, from a structural standpoint, getting comfortable. I tried to assess whether stepping away was something I could do, or whether doing it would change whatever equilibrium was currently present. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said. There was a pause. Commander Davith Sal's expression did not change. "That is not your assessment to make." "Probably not," I agreed. "But I'm the one standing here." He did not have an immediate response to this. I had the brief and disorienting sense that I had said something that landed in a register he hadn't prepared for. It was not the register of defiance or of challenge, but just the register of a tired man stating a basic fact. I was the one standing there. The Karath was against my shoulder. Those were the facts of the situation as they currently stood. The commander's assessment of who should make what decisions did not change the facts. He said something in Varath to Gethrak Ven, who moved forward with the suppression interface at a different setting. The handler was within 2 meters when the Karath made the sound again, not the settled resonance it had been making, a different sound. Not loud, directional, and it was directed at Gethrak Ven. The handler stopped. The sound was not aggression exactly. Beat. I've thought about this for a long time, and I've spoken with people who work with large animals, and the best description I can offer is that it was a clear statement of preference. The Karath knew the handler. The Karath knew what the handler was there to do. The Karath was indicating that it had a different preference. The frills had not opened. The creature had not moved. But Gethrak Ven stood very still for a long moment and then, making no sound himself, stepped back to the perimeter. The lower cargo bay was silent for what I estimated was 40 seconds. Possibly a minute. It felt longer. I counted people at the forward wall. The garrison soldiers were still in position. But the formation had the quality of a formation that does not know what it is responding to. The suppression operation had a structure, a protocol, presumably, a sequence of actions designed to produce a specific outcome. French. That structure had encountered a Karath, sitting down beside a civilian and declining to be recalled. And the structure did not have a clear next step. I watched two of the garrison soldiers exchange a look with each other. The kind of look that happens when people in a shared situation realize, simultaneously, that they are equally without guidance. It was brief. They both went back to watching the Karath. It was the most human thing I had seen from garrison personnel in 3 weeks, and I found it oddly settling to witness. Behind me, the crowd had done something I had not expected. In the first minutes after the creature's entry, they had pressed back in the collective wave of version. Now they had stilled. The silence in the bay was no longer the compressed, held-breath silence of people waiting for something bad to happen. It was a different kind of silence. The silence of people watching something they did not understand and could not look away from. Could feel it at my back, the way you feel weather. The quality of a crowd's attention when the crowd has shifted from fear into something else. Safety, not quite, but not the raw animal press of flight either. Something between. Something that needed a name it didn't have yet. The Karath's weight was still against my shoulder. The frills were still folded. Commander Davithsal turned to the Imperial Observer. I could not hear what was said. I could see from across the bay the observer's expression was one of the blankest expressions I have ever seen on a Varath face. Have since learned that blankness of that particular quality in Varath administrative officials is the equivalent of something being noted. Carefully for the record, the commander turned back to me. Refugee Voss, he said, you will remain where you are. The Karath will be re-evaluated by the handler unit. The demonstration is concluded. All right, I said. He turned and walked back to the platform. The civilian population of the bay did not move for another 10 minutes, not because they were restrained, but because no one was sure whether moving was the correct action given what had just happened. Then a garrison soldier opened the aft hatch and said, in a carefully ordinary voice, that the bay was open for return to quarters, and people began to file out. Sela found me at the edge of the front row. She had been in the third row. I had not known this. I had not seen her, and she put her hand on my arm and looked at the Karath with the particular calm she has. She did not get from me, and which I have always attributed to her mother. Is it okay, she said. I looked at the Karath, had not moved and was still against my shoulder. I think so, I said. Are you okay? Yes, I said. She nodded. She stood there for a moment. Then she said, it's warmer than I thought it would be. And she reached out and put her own hand briefly against the flank of the creature, which made the low resonant sound again. And then she went back to the tier. I stayed in the cargo bay until Gethrak Ven and 2 other handlers returned with fresh equipment and spent approximately 40 minutes working with the Karath, patiently and without any suppression commands. I watched from the side, not touching the creature now, just present. The handlers spoke to it in Varath, in low voices, and the creature oriented toward them and eventually, in stages, persuaded to move toward the forward hatch. It stopped once, near the hatch, and turned its headmass back toward the bay. I was the only civilian left. The frills were flat, the way they had been when it was settled against me, and then it turned and went through the hatch. The formal inquiry into the incident began 2 days later. The inquiry was conducted jointly by the garrison's administrative officer and the Imperial Observer, Varath Deal. I was interviewed on 3 occasions, which was 2 more occasions than I would have preferred. The questions were careful and thorough. What had I done to prepare for the Karath's entry? What previous experience did I have with Karath or similar organisms? Had I received any instruction or training in Varath compliance, procedures that might have given me specific knowledge? I answered all of these honestly, which is to say, I said I had done nothing to prepare. I had no previous experience with any such creature, and I had received no training beyond the block warden orientation that the liaison office had provided. The third interview was different in register from the first 2. It was conducted by Varath Deal alone, in a small office near the garrison bay, and the observer spent less time asking questions and more time reading documents on a flat display and occasionally making notes. Near the end of the session, the observer looked up from the display and said, "You remain still." "Yes," I said. "Most beings do not remain still. I didn't have anywhere to go." The observer considered this. The Karath's behavioral record includes 112 deployment incidents. In none of them has the creature declined a recall signal. I did not say anything to this. "The garrison's assessment," Karath said, "is that the civilian population produced an anomalous biochemical signature during the incident, which disrupted the Karath's conditioning response. Creature's handler has offered a technical report supporting this assessment." "All right," I said. "My assessment," the observer said, "is different." I waited. The Karath's resonance frills were in full rest position for a period of approximately 11 minutes. This is not consistent with disrupted conditioning. It is consistent with voluntary de-escalation. The observer paused. "The distinction is meaningful from an administrative standpoint." I understood that this was a conversation with a shape to it, that there were things being communicated in the gaps between what was being said. I was not certain I understood all of them. I said, "Does the distinction mean practically?" "The garrison's assessment, if accepted, allows Commander Davith Sal to file the incident as equipment anomaly and proceed with a modified compliance protocol. The incident is contained." Karath looked at the flat display again. "My assessment, if filed, requires a review of the deployment authorization. The Karath cannot be used as a compliance instrument if the record shows voluntary de-escalation to a civilian subject. It raises classification questions. And what does that mean for the people on this barge?" The observer looked at me steadily. "It means the modified compliance protocol does not proceed." There was a silence. I looked at the surface of the table and thought about Torvin, the machinist, and the tools he'd handed over, and the 2 days he hadn't spoken. I thought about the woman in the first row with the child on her hip. "File your assessment," I said. Karath filed it that evening. I learned this from the garrison liaison the following morning, who told me with the expression of someone's delivering a piece of information they are not sure whether to be pleased or troubled by. The garrison liaison was a Karath named Orithvel, who had, over 3 weeks, become something approaching a functional colleague, in the sense that we had both accepted the terms of the situation we were operating in and were trying to make it work with the tools available. She told me the assessment had been filed, and she told me what would happen next, which was a review from the Imperial Administrative level, which would take time. The Karath was housed, during this period, in the forward section of the lower cargo bay, in a segmented space that the garrison had designated for equipment. I know this because Gethric Ven told me. He found me on the 3rd day after the incident during the morning meal distribution, which surprised me, and he asked, in careful standard language, with a Karath accent, whether I would be willing to spend time near the Karath. "Not with the creature." "Near it," he said. In the same space, he explained that the creature's behavioral metrics since the incident had been problematic from a recertification standpoint, and that proximity to me appeared to stabilize certain readings. I told him I was not sure that was something I could agree to without more information about what it involved. He gave me the information. It involved sitting in the forward cargo section near the storage divider, in a chair that the garrison would provide, approximately 90 minutes per day. The Karath would be on the other side of the divider. There was no physical contact. He showed me the space. He showed me where I would sit. He showed me the divider, which was a solid partition with ventilation gaps at floor level. And he explained that the creature was aware of presence through resonance and biochemical signature, even through solid partitions, and that my presence near the partition was what produced the stable readings. "I don't understand why," I said. Gethric Ven was quiet for a moment. He had the look of someone deciding how much to say. Then he said, "A Karath extends resonance frills to read its environment. Frills are extended, the creature is in assessment state. It is reading for threat, for prey, for pack. When frills are folded, creature is at rest." He paused. "Since the incident in the bay, the Karath folds its frills when it detects your signature. It does not do this for other signatures present on this vessel." I thought about this. That seems like it should be in the garrison's report. It is in Gethrick Ven's technical report, he said, with the slight emphasis of a man distinguishing between his report and a different report. I sat beside the partition for 90 minutes that afternoon, in the chair the garrison provided, with a maintenance manual Sella had loaned me as reading material because she said I looked like I needed something to do with my hands. Chair was a standard garrison issue folding unit, metal frame, not designed for comfort but adequate for sitting. The forward cargo section was quieter than the rest of the vessel, which was itself not loud. But there was a specific quality to the silence here that was different from the silence in the occupied parts of the barge. It had the quality of a space where something large was at rest, a density to the quiet, a sense of breathing that was not audible but was somehow present. I could not hear the Karath through the partition. I could feel, very faintly, a change in the air pressure that I thought was the creature's resonance, at low resting frequency. It was not unpleasant. It was 3 weeks of accumulating and crowding, and the grinding of institutional process, unusually quiet. I read 7 pages of the maintenance manual, which was about climate regulation systems in early generation transit vessels, and was exactly as interesting as that sounds, and I sat with the quiet and breathed through the cracked rib, carefully, and thought about nothing in particular for the remaining time. When the 90 minutes were done, I felt, without fully understanding why, like I had slept. I went back the next day, and the day after. Sela came with me on the 4th day. She sat on the floor next to my chair with her knees pulled up and her own reading material, and did not say much, which is what Sela does when she is comfortable. At the end of the session she said, "Do you think knows it's us?" I told her Gethrick Ven had said the creature read signatures, biochemical and resonance-based, and that it appeared to distinguish mine from others on the vessel. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "So it knows it's you, apparently." She started, and then didn't finish. She looked at the partition. "That's kind of something," she said. It was kind of something. Commander Davithsal was reassigned on day 7 after the incident. The order came from the Imperial Administrative Review, which had moved faster than Vareth Deal had indicated it might. The garrison liaison told me this with an expression I could not fully read, and I asked her what the reassignment meant for the vessel's operation. She said a replacement commander had been designated and would board when the barge docked at the transit waypoint in 4 days. In the interim, the garrison's executive officer was in operational command. The executive officer, a Vareth named Kevrat Ashan, made no modifications to the civilian compliance protocols. She made no demonstrations. She conducted one general assembly during which she explained, in brief and neutral language, that the administrative review was ongoing and that the civilian contingent's cooperation in maintaining orderly procedures was noted. She spoke for approximately 4 minutes. The assembly disbanded. People went back to their schedules. The modified compliance protocol was not implemented. I continued sitting beside the partition for the remaining 7 days of the transit. Gethrick Ven continued to provide the chair and to share, in his careful way, information about the Karath's behavioral metrics. The metrics, he told me, had stabilized to a range consistent with a Karath in sustained rest state, which was not the state the creature was supposed to be in while aboard a processing vessel, but which was, from a handling standpoint, preferred to the alternative. On the 10th day, the partition was removed. I was not expecting this. I arrived for the afternoon session, and the divider was gone, and the Karath was in the full forward cargo space, and Gethrick Ven was standing at the side wall. He said that the recertification review had determined the Karath was not suitable for redeployment in its current state, that for the purposes of completing the transit, the creature would be housed in the forward cargo space in what he described as a non-operational rest protocol. "What does that mean for the session?" I asked. "It means the session is in the same space," he said. I sat in the chair in the open forward cargo space with the Karath and Gethrick Ven, and the faint particulate light coming through the ventilation gaps in the hull. The space was larger than I'd experienced it through the partition, and the Karath was larger than I remembered from the cargo bay, which surprised me even though it shouldn't have. In the bay there had been 800 people as a reference scale, and here there was only the hold and the 2 of us. The creature's 6 limbs moved with that same unhurried quality as it crossed toward me. It stopped at my side and lowered its head mass, and the frills lay flat against the head without any intermediate extension, no assessment sweep, no reading. They just folded, as though folding were the obvious thing. The Karath came to me within the first 5 minutes, not with urgency, not with the kind of movement that suggests a creature that has been held back and is now released, but with the same settled, deliberate quality it had had in the cargo bay. It lowered its head mass against my shoulder, and the frills were flat, and the resonant sound started, the low, steady one. Put my hand on the side of its head. Gethrak Ven sat down against the wall with his own paperwork, and we were all 3 quiet for 90 minutes. When the session ended and I stood to leave, the Karath did not try to follow. It watched me cross to the hatch, frills still flat, and then settled itself further down onto its hindmost limbs, in the posture it had developed over the last several days, the posture that Gethrak Ven had described to me as consistent with a Karath, preparing for extended rest. I closed the hatch behind me. I stood in the corridor for a moment before going back to the tier. The barge docked at Vareth Interior Station 44 on day 31. The civilian processing continued from there. Different paperwork, different queues, the long, slow machinery of resettlement administered by a different set of officials in a different facility with the same institutional smell of circulated air and waiting. I have been through enough of that machinery now that the details have blurred together. What I remember specifically from the docking is standing in the exit queue at the barge's main disembarkation hatch, with Sela beside me and my bag, over my shoulder, waiting to cross to the station, and hearing the resonant sound from somewhere forward in the vessel. I did not go forward. There was a queue. There was a process. Sela's hand was on my arm. I stayed in the queue and I went through the hatch and across the boarding bridge, to the station. The formal record, which I have seen a copy of, notes the following. Karath Unit 7 Nareth, garrison designation, was classified non-operational at the conclusion of the Orith Barge 7 transit and was returned to the Vareth Fleet Biological Assessment Unit at Interior Station 44. The creature was logged as unsuitable for further compliance deployment. The reason given in the technical report is behavioral conditioning interruption. Gethrak Ven's supplementary note, which is attached to the record as an addendum, uses different language. The note is 2 sentences. The first sentence describes the behavioral metrics at the conclusion of the transit. The second sentence reads, Unit demonstrates sustained voluntary rest response to a single civilian subject. This response is incompatible with operational deployment and is, in the handler's assessment, not a malfunction. I have read that sentence many times. I am still not sure what it means, in the way that you can understand something factually and still not be sure what it means. I know what the Vareth intended the Karath to do in that cargo bay. I know what happened instead. I know the shape of the thing that happened. The weight against my shoulder, the folded frills, the low sound of something settling into rest, the specific quality of warmth from something alive that has decided to be where it is. I know that Vareth Deal's assessment was filed and that Davith Sal was reassigned and that 800 people completed the rest of that transit without another compliance demonstration. I know that Torvin the machinist eventually started speaking again, about 10 days after the bay, and that by the time we docked he had formed a kind of workers' informal committee that helped people navigate the resettlement forms. I know that none of that was because I was brave. I was not brave. I was a tired man with a cracked rib and nowhere to go, and something very large looked at me and decided that was enough. Sela is 22 now. She asks me about it sometimes, when we're in the same city, which is not as often as I'd like. She asks about the Karath the way she asked about it at the partition, not with the frame of heroism, not with the frame of the story that interviewers want, with the specific curiosity of someone who was there and saw it and is still turning it over. The last time she asked, she said, "Do you think it was afraid?" I thought about the resonance in the cargo bay, the shift in pressure when the creature entered, the subsonic dread that had moved through 800 people like a wave. I think, I said, it was probably very tired of being what it was being used for. Sela thought about this, then she nodded slowly, The way she nods when something lands in the right place. Yeah, she said, probably. I don't know what happened to the Karath after Interior Station 44. The record doesn't say, and I've looked. Gethrickvin, when I managed to reach him through the administrative contact system 2 years after the transit, said that he had been reassigned before the assessment unit completed its review, and that he didn't have visibility into the outcome. He said one other thing. At the end of that message, which I will include here because it is the closest thing I have to an ending, he said, in my experience with Karath, the resonance rest state is not something they perform. It is not conditioning. A Karath that is resting has decided to rest, and a Karath that has decided to rest beside you has decided that you are where it is safe. I do not know what it detected in you. I know that in 4 deployment cycles I did not see it decide this before. I read that message in a small apartment in the resettlement district of a city I am still learning to navigate. Sela was in university by then, transit stops away, studying environmental systems, doing well. Outside the window was the ordinary traffic of an ordinary street, people going about the business of ordinary days. I sat with the message for a while, the display down, and went to make something for dinner, because it was evening and I was hungry, and the day had been long. And that was what there was to do. That is the honest version. That is all of it. I have nothing more to add.